You know what time it is. Money, power, politics. We're going to drill down on Donald Trump's search for a Treasury Secretary because whoever he picks will play a critical role in helping Trump deliver on his economic agenda. The New York Times points out this. Mr. Trump is seeking a Treasury Secretary who will carry out his unconventional plans. In other words, big tax cuts, big tariffs, and no way to pay for it. That part is mine, while still having the credibility to keep markets buoyant. And that mix of qualities is not easy to find. Okay, talk about an understatement. For more, let's bring in Heather Long, Washington Post opinions columnist, and David Gura, correspondent for Bloomberg and host of the Big Take podcast. He joins us from Rio, Brazil right now, where he is there for the G20. But, David, let's start with these Treasury Secretary picks. Right now, the frontrunners appear to be hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, investor Mark Rowan, the guy's the CEO of Apollo, huge business guy, and former Fed board member Kevin Warsh, who's basically a Ben Bernanke deputy. These are hugely qualified guys, but with the exception of Bessent, who has kind of pledged the super Trump loyalty, it's unclear if these two guys are fully on board to execute Trump's plans. I mean, both of them in their professional current experience do not want to put us back into an inflationary environment, and that's exactly what Trump policies would do.
No, you've got it exactly right. So I look at those three individuals. They're all billionaires. I look at Kevin Warsh in particular. He's as establishment as they come. He went to Harvard. He's got an appointment at Stanford. He's a billionaire by marriage. I guess that's the defining quality of those three men. They're all billionaires, and that's a mark of success here for the president. But you're getting at something really key here is these are men who know the way Wall Street works, have a great familiarity with economics. They're folks who I would assume have listened to the conventional thinking when it comes to tariffs and the implications that these policies would have on inflation in this country, on the economy more broadly. And I think, as you rightly point out, they'd find themselves in a very tricky position if they were to get this job, having to at once please this president, who, with the exception of Scott Bessent, are not loyalists to Trump. They're not very Trumpy, as I see them, and all the while trying to instill confidence in the markets that both they know what they're doing as they proceed in this job, and the president does as well. So I think it would be a really tricky moment for them to be in. And I look at this other individual who's also in the running, Bill Hagerty, the senator from Tennessee. I don't see him as a likely candidate for this job, but I see the president-elect trying to find somebody who pleases both sides and how tricky that is for him going forward here.
Heather, our national debt is already $36 trillion. Inflation is a problem. It has been one of the biggest problems that President Biden has faced, and obviously VP Harris did in the election. How tough a job are any of these men walking into, given what policies Trump wants to put forward, and that inflation is already a problem?
It is. And I think what we're seeing here in the last 24 hours is one of the few things that still intimidates Trump is the markets. You know, why are we having this horse race for Treasury Secretary? Because he's a little nervous, right? He saw the big surge in the stock market after the election. He loved it. But last week it tapered off as people are starting to look again at his agenda and get worried that it is inflationary, that it is going to run up the debt. And you and I know that we especially saw a freak out in the bond market, which is really kind of curbing a little bit of what's going on here. So even if he can get all the Republicans in Congress to roll over and endorse his agenda, the markets are pushing back a little bit.
And none of these three guys want to humiliate themselves, right? We're not talking, JV guys who are dying to have their name in the spotlight. Like, yes, they want this superpower, and I'm sure they're drawn into it, but they will be humiliated in their personal lives, in their professional lives, if they end up flat on their face.
I think you're right, but I would say one thing. Mark Rowan, keep an eye on him. He and his wife donated over $1 million to Trump's 2020 campaign. So he may not be your classic loyalist, but he's been there in the Trump fold for a long time when some other Wall Street executives aren't.
Well, also, given his position in Apollo, how much he could end up saving in taxes if he steps out of Apollo and into this job, it could be north of $1 billion, which that's a lot of money. All right, David, Howard Lutnick was in the running. Trump ended up picking him for Commerce Secretary. Elon Musk was kind of through this last-minute Hail Mary pass for Lutnick. That's his boy. What do you think Musk could get out of Lutnick as Commerce Secretary?
Well, I think he's obviously established this quick relationship with him as he has with Donald Trump. He feels some familiarity there, and I think that he sees in Howard Lutnick a kind of pliability here for the policies that he has in place. I think there's probably a little mutual admiration between these two individuals. But you look at Elon Musk and the role he's playing now. He is so closely intertwined with the government broadly, not just the Trump government to be, but the government now in terms of all of the companies that he's running that have contracts with the federal government. So anything that he can do to kind of put somebody into government who is in his good graces, who admires him or thinks he's doing the right thing is going to be advantageous for him. And I'm curious as I watch all this unfold, the degree to which that has staying power here. I mean, again, I just want to emphasize how quickly these friendships, so much as they are friendships, have come together here. It wasn't long ago that there was bad blood between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Now there is this bromance, this familiarity. I think that there is some wise skepticism from a lot of people about how long that's likely to last as he exerts what's really some extraordinary influence here throughout this process, not just selecting the Treasury Secretary or the Commerce Secretary, but really being by the President-elect's side. He was there at a SpaceX launch today, kind of talking into his ear almost constantly, be that in New York or Washington or Mar-a-Lago. It's a level of influence from a major businessman, the likes of which we haven't seen in a very long time, Steph.
Heather, a crypto CEO might end up with a position in this administration, and people who don't know crypto, who aren't invested in it, are suddenly watching it fly. Should there be a concern for people? I mean, this is a currently wildly unregulated space where there could be some wrongdoing in there, is a safe way to put it.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a friendly crypto administration, and we're already starting to see that line up in a number of different roles. Howard Lutnick at Commerce being the latest one, who's obviously been very supportive of Tether, among other crypto. I think, though, we have to realize that in cross America, the mood around crypto has shifted.
Totally.
You know, this is definitely something, particularly in communities of color, that's seen as a very valid investment, as a very valid alternative to the dollar. But you're right. What you worry about, what you and I worry about,
regulation.
Yes, is you want to make sure that people don't put all their savings. You don't want to see somebody putting all their retirement money into this and really getting hurt. It is still a very highly volatile asset. I think people sometimes see it like gold, and it's not. It could lose all of its value overnight, and you just want to protect people from that. So you're right. I do worry about that going forward, that all the guardrails could come off here.
That's certainly dangerous. All right, David, let's talk about your trip to Brazil. You're obviously down there for the G20 summit with President Biden. What are other world leaders down there saying about the incoming Trump administration? I'm sure they're being very, very careful in all their word choices, because given how he rolls, you don't want to get on his bad side, at least not publicly. What are you hearing?
Yeah, they're being pretty circumspect about it. I think what's interesting is several of these G20 members have been through this before. So it's not like back in 2016 when Barack Obama was heading out of office and there was a lot of uncertainty about how Donald Trump would govern, what he would be like as a president. Many of these leaders know how he governs and what he's like. So that element of uncertainty is gone here. But, you know, we saw today this news overnight about what's happened in Ukraine, how that's been ratcheted up. And they're kind of looking at one another, trying to figure out what the path forward is going to be in that conflict, for geopolitics more broadly, for the global economy. And all the while, there's this huge variable. We've seen a very diminished Joe Biden here in Rio de Janeiro, not having a whole lot of meetings one-on-one with other leaders as he kind of tries to solidify his legacy and lay some foundation for policies to continue to the next president. But he is not the major player here. Everyone is looking north to Mar-a-Lago, to South Florida, to the president-elect, and just not knowing exactly what he's going to do, if the bluster that we've heard on the campaign trail and in the transition thus far is going to translate into actual policy, and what's likely to happen on January 20th. So I think you have a lot of leaders who are at once confused, uncertain about what's going to happen policy-wise when Donald Trump comes into office, and also just trying to make overtures toward him as much as they can. Javier Milei of Argentina, for instance, going to Mar-a-Lago to pay his respects to the president-elect. I think we're going to see a lot more of that as leaders try to find whatever inroads they can here to Donald Trump and try to get into his good graces as he becomes president once again, Steph.